We pick up our discussion of the New Culture movement with an examination of early 20th century critiques of language and culture. So in the previous video, we discussed the question of women's equality, and another target of New Culture era writers and activists was a critique of Chinese language and by way of that Chinese culture. In the previous video, I shared with you this passage from On Literary Revolution by Chen Duxiu. I won't go back over it again, but suffice it to say that for many, the conclusion that they had arrived at in the wake of the failed 1911 revolution was that culture was the prime battleground for the fate, really, of China. Any sort of political change without a deeper cultural change was, in the minds of many of these figures, destined to fail, be it a parliamentary system, a constitution, even revolution itself. So one of the targets was the Chinese language itself, and in particular the writing system. And so one of the main outgrowths of the New Culture movement was the vernacularization movement, or the Baihua movement. Now, in essence, in a nutshell, the premise of Baihua was that written Chinese should resemble spoken Chinese. And in another video that I presented, I'll include the link in the description and also try to add a card, I described the difference, broadly speaking, between literary Chinese and spoken Chinese. And even up until this moment, although there are exceptions to what I'm about to say, classical or literary Chinese and spoken Chinese are almost like two different Chinese languages. And the way in which the Confucian literati or elite literati coming through, for example, the civil service examination, the materials that they read and memorized and studied, and the either the prose or poetry that they were able to produce was all in this this neighborhood or this domain of classical Chinese. And yet the way that someone at a tea shop or someone buying vegetables at a market, the kind of language that they were using in the course of everyday life orally was very different. And the general premise was that in order for China to modernize, this required things like mass literacy, because without mass literacy, you cannot have mass participation in politics and civic government. And in order for literacy to achieve any kind of extent, we need to move away from this elite form of writing and bring writing itself, the writing of the Chinese language, into alignment with the way that hundreds of millions of people actually speak it. And that's what is at the heart of the vernacularization movement. Now, it's very important to note that New Culture did not invent the vernacular movement. There were important precedents for this, certainly in the late Qing dynasty, and there are plenty of examples from earlier in, especially kind of early modern, late imperial China, of writings that are, if you actually parse them, especially plays, works of theater, are hybrids of something like a vernacular and a classical form. So it's not as if this is a stark beginning point, but it is arguably the most aggressive that the most aggressive and widespread vernacularization movement thus far in Chinese history. So just to give you a sense again, and I made a video about this, but just to get a sense, let's consider this poem by the 8th century poet Wang Wei, Parting. And let's look at the difference between the original, written in what we would think of as classical Chinese, and then, very interestingly, a translation of that poem, not into English, that's what we have here on this slide, but rather into vernacular or modern Chinese. And so on the left side of this slide, we have the original poem, and on the right side, someone has gone and translated this into more or less kind of a vernacular spoken form of Chinese. What you'll notice at the outset is that the spoken form is much longer, and that's not by accident. the classical form is extremely economical, and really the base unit of meaning in classical Chinese is the individual character. Every single character needs to be interpreted for its semantic meaning. In the context of oral, but also this new vernacular style, typically speaking, the average unit of meaning is either one or two characters. And the reason for this is quite simple. If we remember that language begins as an oral form, it begins as a form of oral communication. If I were to try to speak to you in a highly economical form of spoken language, in which every phoneme that came out of my mouth was itself sort of had to be individually parsed and interpreted in order for you to understand me, this would make cognitively your job of understanding me extremely hard, especially because in Chinese, as in many other languages, but especially in Chinese, there are many, many homophones. That is to say, there are many different characters, many different single character words that have the exact same pronunciation. Maybe a different tone, because Chinese is a tonal language, but the same pronunciation. And a single character, the phoneme yi corresponds to dozens and dozens and dozens of Chinese characters. So if you and I were just trying to sell our goods in the market, and I were to try to speak to you in this classical form, arguably you would have no idea what I was saying, even if you were fluent in Chinese, because every phoneme coming out of my mouth would potentially correspond to any number of potential interpretations. Yes, we might be able to rule out some of them given the context of our exchange, but we would be at a loss. And so what human beings did long ago was developed a sort of disambiguation technique, a way of triangulating the meaning. And in essence, speakers of Chinese, spoken Chinese, developed this strategy of more or less built-in redundancy. And so in the case of spoken Chinese, many of the core kind of units of meaning are two characters, and yet curiously, in many of these terms, the two characters kind of have the same meaning. Like if you were to take these two characters in spoken Chinese and split them up and then just look up the dictionary definition of each of them separately, they would actually kind of overlap. They might not be identical, but they're overlapping. And that's on purpose, because what you're doing by using two terms that have roughly the same kind of connotation, you are indicating to your listener, you can rule out all of those other potential homophones. I'm talking about this connotation of this sound. Now, of course, it's not so explicit. It's even subconscious, but that's the way that spoken language has emerged so that two human beings can have a fighting chance of understanding each other. Well, if you have a written form, you're not relying on this oral communication. You can actually see the Chinese character. And so if I see a Chinese character that has the pronunciation E, I'm not confused as to which E it is because I can see the character there. And so the technology of writing at least opens up the possibility for classical Chinese to evolve in this highly economical way. And so this is something that new culture era reformers and radicals wanted to break down and reimagine. They wanted the way that people were writing and learning the Chinese language, be it in school or in reading of essays or reading of newspapers or official policy, official curriculum textbooks. They wanted written Chinese form to include these kinds of redundancies so that it reflected how people actually conducted themselves in everyday life. So this is what the vernacularization movement is known. And one of the most stirring works of fiction to play with this dialectic of classical and vernacular is A Madman's Diary, or Diary of a Madman by Lu Xun. And this is something that's actually lost in translation when you read the text in English, because in English, everything is just in English. But if you read the original, Lu Xun has this brilliant sort of duplicity where there is a preface to the work. So the ostensible author of the work has written a preface to what will follow, which will be The Madman's Diary. And the preface is written in classical, or is composed in classical Chinese. And then you turn the page, and now you're reading the diary of a madman, the madman's diary, and it is in vernacular. So there's a double shock at play in a madman's diary, and only one of them comes through when you read it in English, but both of them come through when you read it in Chinese. So not only do you have the story of a madman's diary, which is the story of a man who is either insane and sort of a paranoid, delusional figure who looks out on the world and sees cannibals all about him, or he is the only person in the world who actually sees the truth that he is surrounded by cannibals. So, but what's extra stirring, and again, just to revisit this, is that when you would be reading, if someone were to read this for the first time in Chinese, there would be a double shock. There would be the shock of reading this in written vernacular form and passages like this, all these people wanting to eat human flesh and at the same time stealthily trying to keep up appearances, et cetera, et cetera. So new culture, again, is one of the main moments in modern Chinese history which pushed the question of vernacularization to an unprecedented extent. And here we have just the kind of core concept within Lu Xun's idea of eat people, 吃人. Anyway, the other big piece of language reform in the New Culture movement, and this one also had a long-lasting effect, obviously, for anyone who speaks Chinese or anyone who's gone through any Chinese language schooling system or has studied Chinese as a foreign language knows that vernacularization wins the day. It is actually by the early 20s in China that the Ministry of Education basically adopts officially a vernacular form of the language as the medium of education, and no longer is the learning of classical Chinese something that one does in order to, have a pathway to government or to power, to leadership. So we are basically the grandchildren of this vernacularization movement. Another campaign that had lasting effect was the effort to change the way in which Chinese characters were written. They appeared on the page, and this is what's known as simplification. So I give you some examples in this slide of the general strategies. There were many strategies that went into how the protocols by which we were going to change these characters. But in essence, it is about the economization of pen strokes or brush strokes. So we need to remember that simplicity in this concept, the simplification of Chinese characters, is not an absolute concept. It is a relational concept. This is simplicity with respect to composition by hand. This is not simplicity with respect to recognition, because technically I'm no cognitive scientist, but I know enough about the brain to say that the brain actually thrives off of the additional information that one finds in the so-called traditional characters. There's more that the brain has to work with in order to distinguish it from all other graphs. So it's not simplicity with regard to just seeing it. It's simplicity with regard to learning how to write it. So if you look at the example on the right side of this slide with the character Li, history, or Long, the bottom right, of dragon, you can see that the dragon character, the bottom right character there, there's a massive reduction in the number of strokes to produce it. I won't count it here, but it goes from probably close to 20 strokes to down to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 strokes. So again, simplicity with respect to composition. Again, the goal being to lower the barriers to widespread literacy by the sort of the Chinese masses. Interestingly, with regard to this campaign at the time does not succeed. It doesn't really take hold, in large part because of the chaos of the warlord period, but also the chaos of the interregnum between the warlord period and the outbreak of the Second World War, and then of course the Second World War. So simplification the simplification of Chinese will reappear in the 1950s with the communist government, and that simplification campaign takes hold. But it was advanced by new culture movements, new culture kind of figures, and again, they didn't invent it. efforts to simplify Chinese characters goes back arguably to the late Qing dynasty. But once again, this is probably the most aggressive campaign to date. Another part of this that I think is relevant is that these simplifications, meaning these altered forms of the characters, these are not just made up shapes that that Lu Xun or somebody sat down and concocted. By and large, this effort at simplification was really to take things that average Chinese writers were doing anyway, that is basically taking forms of more or less Chinese cursive or kind of informal abbreviated forms of Chinese characters that people just in their course of their everyday life were already using. And then basically making those the official forms or the official forms of Chinese characters. So there's an interesting idea here, which I think runs through a lot of the May 4th era, which is let's take what people actually do and make that, and rather than treating that as an aberration of what they should do, so let's make what they really do the official thing that we teach everyone to do. So if we have spoken language, which is how people actually speak Chinese, and then we have this literary form which stands at a major distance from it, let's invert that and let's make the informal way of doing Chinese the formal way. And then classical Chinese can be something that if you want to learn it, you can. And in the case of simplification, we have the standard character up here, and then we have the way that everybody writes it when they're writing letters to home, letters home or in their diary, and they're making all of these abbreviated forms and all of these cursive forms. Rather than treating those as the aberration of the standard, let's make this the standard. And so this is part of a broader discussion about the idea of making the masses official in a variety of capacities, of course, still mediated by elites. It's still elites who get to make these decisions. So they still retain their power at the top of the apex, but there is an effort here to make official that which was once informal. Now, there's one other point here. I won't dwell on it because I wrote an entire book on it, and for any students who are interested in this, I'd love to hear what you think of the book. But there's also the technological question. The end of the 19th century and the early 20th century was a period of just unprecedented transformation in communication technologies, inscription and reproduction technologies. We think of the internet as the sort of the big deal of the modern period. Arguably, telegraphy deserves that title. The speed at which telegraphy was able to transmit at a distance or communicate at a distance, and the effects that had on people's understandings of space and time and their lives, and arguably remains unparalleled to the present day. Someone who lived through the telegraphic revolution may have gone through more than someone who lived through the internet revolution, or they would be close. It would be a photo finish to see which of those two was more unsettling, let's say. But there was a problem here, at least from the perspective of China and the Chinese language, is that all of these new technologies, all of them, were premised on the existence of alphabets, an alphabet which the Chinese language does not have. There is no alphabet or syllabary in Chinese, just characters. Well, how do you build a typewriter for a language, a writing system that has no alphabet? How do you make Morse code when you don't have any letters to turn into little dots and dashes? How do you make a variety of technologies? Well, that is something that is taken up by a number of engineers, mainly Chinese, but also foreign engineers, about how in the world are we going to bring all of these alphabet-biased technologies that are changing the way businesses run, war is conducted, economies run, and so forth. Profoundly important technologies. How do we bring them into the Chinese language environment? And I will leave that for a later discussion. If anyone's interested in that, I will point you in the direction of either some things that I've written or some things that I would recommend. Okay, in the next video, we're going to carry on our discussion of the New Culture movement, so be sure to stick around.